What happens when a franchise finally stops pretending, finally drops the PR smile, and finally tells the truth about who actually matters inside the locker room? The moment the Chicago Sky named Camila Cardoso as Player of the Year over Angel Reese, it wasn't just an award announcement, it was a public indictment, a franchise-level verdict that exposed everything Reese had tried to control through noise, pressure, and self-mythology. Because this decision didn't come out of nowhere, it came after months of tension, entitlement, locker room fractures, and increasingly reckless public commentary that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of leadership, value, and accountability in professional basketball. And when you strip away the social media clout, the endorsement hype, and the manufactured narratives, what remains is the uncomfortable truth Chicago could no longer hide. Angel Reese was never the engine of this team, she was the turbulence, while Cardoso became the stabilizer, the constant, the professional who showed up every night, did her job, elevated others quietly, and earned trust without demanding it. And that contrast matters. Because franchises don't make these statements lightly, not when marketing departments, ticket sales, and league optics are all on the line. But Chicago still chose consistency over celebrity, production over provocation, and reliability over rhetoric. And that choice instantly reframed Reese's standing within the organization. Because after months of Reese publicly criticizing teammates, openly questioning roster quality, and positioning herself as someone who deserved better pieces around her, the Sky responded not with words but with action, and actions are the only language that actually matters in this league, especially when those actions directly contradict the self-image a player is trying to project. Reese framed herself as the centerpiece, the gravitational force that could attract elite talent. Yet the organization implicitly rejected that framing by elevating Cardoso, the player who didn't demand the spotlight, didn't weaponize the media, didn't alienate veterans, and didn't treat professionalism like a bargaining chip. And that decision became even more damning when placed alongside Reese's now infamous interview with the Chicago Tribune, where she declared that settling for the current roster was non-negotiable, a phrase that landed like a grenade in a locker room filled with veterans who had sacrificed, battled injuries, and committed their careers to surviving in the most unforgiving league in women's sports. Because when a second-year player publicly announces that her teammates are not good enough, it doesn't read as ambition, it reads as arrogance, and worse, it reads as someone who doesn't yet understand that leadership begins with respect, not leverage. The timing couldn't have been more destructive either, because those comments landed while Courtney Vandersloot, a championship-proven veteran, was rehabbing from an ACL injury. And Reese's thinly veiled doubts about age and reliability didn't just cross a line, they erased it entirely, forcing Vandersloot to publicly defend not just herself but the dignity of veteran players everywhere, a response that immediately highlighted the gulf between lived leadership and performative dominance. Because Vandersloot didn't need to tear anyone down to assert her worth, while Reese seemed incapable of building herself up without diminishing others. And inside that moment, Chicago's locker room fractured in ways fans rarely see but players feel instantly. Because once trust erodes, once teammates start wondering whether the person next to them is secretly lobbying for their replacement, the foundation of team basketball collapses. The front office had already moved pieces to accommodate Reese, including acquiring Ariel Atkins specifically to add experience and stability. And yet Reese still chose public dissatisfaction over internal accountability, which told the organization everything it needed to know about how she viewed partnership versus entitlement. And while Reese spoke about attracting the best of the best, she simultaneously made Chicago sound like a place elite players should fear, a franchise framed as unfinished, unreliable, and requiring a leap of faith, which is the exact opposite of how stars recruit stars. Because free agents don't want drama, they want clarity, structure, and leadership they can trust. That contradiction alone undermined her credibility, but it didn't stop there, because as the season unraveled, Reese's availability became inconsistent, her injury status opaque, and her priorities increasingly difficult to reconcile with her demands, as Chicago repeatedly labeled her day-to-day with no meaningful transparency, leaving coaches unable to plan rotations and teammates unsure who would be beside them on game night. And while accountability was missing on the court, Reese's off-court visibility surged through brand appearances and promotional travel, creating a perception, fair or not, that the team came second to the brand, and in professional sports, perception becomes reality the moment it affects trust. Technical fouls piled up, emotions spilled over, and when discipline finally arrived, it came in the form of internal suspensions that screamed organizational frustration more than corrective intent, revealing a franchise caught between needing Reese's marketability and managing her volatility. And that tension became unsustainable once on-court results exposed the final, most painful truth. The sky didn't collapse without Reese. They functioned more cleanly, more cohesively, with ball movement improving and roles clarifying in her absence, a reality that shattered the illusion that her presence was essential to winning. Especially when turnovers mounted, efficiency dipped, and emotional control faltered whenever she was on the floor. Because star players don't just produce highlights, they stabilize chaos, and Reese too often became the source of it. This is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because while Chicago wrestled with ego management and fractured chemistry, the Indiana Fever were undergoing a transformation built on transparency, humility, and connection under Caitlin Clark, whose approach to leadership exposed everything Reese's wasn't, from traveling with the team while injured to publicly praising teammates and deflecting credit. Clark demonstrated that true influence isn't loud, it's consistent, and that consistency translates directly into trust, buy-in, and ultimately winning, which is why Indiana's culture strengthened while Chicago's eroded, and why Cardoso's recognition as Player of the Year wasn't just deserved, it was inevitable. Because she embodied what franchises actually value when the noise fades: availability, effort, professionalism, and respect for the collective. By choosing Cardoso, the Sky made it clear that leadership isn't declared, it's earned. And that no amount of social media presence can outweigh the damage caused by public criticism, unreliable commitment, and fractured trust. And now the question looming over Chicago isn't emotional, it's strategic. Can a franchise truly move forward with a player who sees teammates as obstacles, accountability as optional, and loyalty as conditional? Or does the healthiest path require a reset that acknowledges what this season already proved? That Angel Reese's vision of leadership no longer aligns with what the Chicago Sky are trying to build, and that sometimes the boldest move isn't doubling down on star power, but letting go of it before it poisons everything around it. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone inside the league already understands. When a locker room stops believing in its star, the breakup has already begun. Once the Chicago Sky quietly but decisively elevated Camila Cardoso over Angel Reese, the internal balance of power shifted permanently. Because awards in professional sports are never just about numbers, they're about trust, alignment, and who the organization believes represents its future when the cameras aren't rolling. And from that moment forward, Reese's public narrative collided head-on with the private reality inside the building, exposing a widening gap between how she viewed herself and how the franchise, her teammates, and even league executives were beginning to see her, not as an unquestioned cornerstone, but as a volatile variable whose presence demanded constant management rather than natural leadership. What made this situation uniquely combustible is that Reese didn't simply express frustration, something every competitive athlete feels. She weaponized it, repeatedly and publicly, framing dissatisfaction as ambition while ignoring the fundamental rule of professional sports: you criticize upward privately or you fracture downward publicly. And once those words left her mouth in interviews, they didn't just echo through Chicago's locker room, they rippled across the entire WNBA, because players listen, agents listen, front offices listen, and everyone understands exactly what it means when a young star says she refuses to settle for the teammates she already has, especially in a league where roster spots are scarce, careers are fragile, and respect is currency. Veterans who had survived multiple rebuilds heard those comments not as competitive fire but as disrespect, and when Courtney Vandersloot responded with calm defiance, defending her age, her recovery, and her commitment, it became painfully obvious who understood leadership and who merely demanded it, because Vandersloot spoke from experience and accountability, while Reese spoke from expectation, and that distinction matters more than talent ever will, especially when adversity hits behind closed doors. Those comments forced Chicago's front office into damage control mode, because now they weren't just managing wins and losses, they were managing trust erosion, locker room resentment, and the perception that one player believed she was bigger than the collective. a perception that becomes lethal when paired with inconsistent availability, unclear injury timelines, and growing questions about priorities. Reese's repeated day-to-day status turned from medical shorthand into organizational paralysis, as coaches struggled to prepare game plans without knowing whether their supposed centerpiece would suit up. Teammates hesitated to fully buy into rotations that might collapse hours before tip-off. And fans began noticing the contrast between her absence on the bench and her presence at brand events, a contrast that, fair or unfair, undermined her credibility at the exact moment she was demanding more accountability from everyone else. The problem wasn't injury itself. Because injuries are part of the game, the problem was opacity. Because transparency builds trust and silence breeds suspicion, and in Reese's case, silence became the loudest statement of all. As technical fouls mounted and emotional discipline slipped, the sky found confidence, while Reese's approach produced the opposite effect: hesitation, division, and fatigue. Inside league circles, the contrast didn't go unnoticed, because executives don't just evaluate talent, they evaluate risk. And Reese increasingly looked like a high-maintenance asset whose brand demanded constant accommodation without delivering proportional stability, the exact profile teams hesitate to build around long-term. This is why Cardoso's Player of the Year recognition mattered so deeply. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't controversial, and that was the point, because Chicago chose the player who embodied availability, coachability, and quiet dominance, sending a message not just to Reese but to the entire league about what kind of culture they intended to prioritize moving forward. At this stage, the question of whether the Sky should trade Angel Reese isn't rooted in emotion or punishment. It's rooted in alignment, because championship trajectories require shared vision, mutual respect, and leaders who elevate rather than alienate. And if a franchise believes, even privately, that its future identity conflicts with its loudest personality, the clock is already ticking. No matter how many jerseys sell or headlines follow. Because teams don't fall apart overnight, they erode slowly. And Chicago's erosion began the moment words replaced accountability, entitlement replaced humility, and the organization realized that its most reliable player wasn't the loudest one, but the one who showed up, stayed grounded, and never needed to remind anyone of her value. The most brutal truth in professional sports isn't exposed by criticism, controversy, or even losing, it's exposed when a team quietly realizes it can breathe without you. That moment arrived for the Chicago Sky not in a press conference or a viral clip, but in the uncomfortable silence that followed games where Angel Reese wasn't available, wasn't present, or wasn't engaged. Because what the organization saw during those stretches shattered the last illusion holding everything together. The Sky didn't look lost, they didn't look broken, and most damning of all, they didn't look incomplete, they looked freer, more fluid, and less emotionally volatile. And once a franchise witnesses that shift, there is no going back, because leverage in sports is built on necessity, and necessity vanished the moment Chicago realized it could function, sometimes more coherently, without bending its entire identity around one player's emotions, demands, and availability. This is where the narrative around Reese collapsed under its own weight, because for months she had positioned herself as indispensable, the magnet for future stars, the cultural engine who deserved a better supporting cast. Yet the on-court evidence told a far colder story, one where turnovers stalled possessions, emotional outbursts disrupted rhythm, and the offense became predictable when it revolved around forcing touches rather than reading flow. And when Reese was out, the ball moved, roles simplified, and players stopped hesitating, a subtle but unmistakable sign that trust was being restored not through speeches, but through absence. Franchises don't ignore patterns like that, especially not in a league as. While Reese's narrative revolved around what she lacked, Cardoso's revolved around what she provided, and in professional sports, provision always beats proclamation. The organizational lesson here was painful but clarifying. Stars don't get to define culture unilaterally, culture defines which stars survive, and Reese's version of leadership, public pressure, selective availability, and self-centered framing, simply didn't align with what Chicago needed to rebuild credibility and cohesion. This misalignment became even more glaring when juxtaposed with the league-wide example unfolding in Indiana, where the Indiana Fever rebuilt not just relevance but belief around Caitlin Clark, a player whose approach to leadership exposed Reese's shortcomings without ever mentioning her name. Because Clark showed what it looks like when a star understands that visibility is responsibility, that transparency builds trust, and that lifting teammates publicly strengthens bonds privately. Clark didn't demand roster upgrades, she elevated what she had, didn't disappear during adversity, she leaned in, didn't create mystery around injuries, she communicated clearly, and that clarity fueled chemistry, attendance, and confidence, proving that the difference between chaos and culture often comes down to emotional intelligence, not skill level. Indiana's rise wasn't accidental, it was intentional, built on selecting not just talent but temperament. And Chicago watched that blueprint succeed in real time while wrestling with the fallout of choosing hype over harmony, a contrast that forced uncomfortable self-reflection inside the Sky's front office. This is why the trade conversation around Reese